Thank you, Stephen, for this for this extremely rich introduction to our conference. I mean, we've already started yesterday, but for me it's the introduction because I was in Zurich. And for a wide variety of themes that you've brought up, I saw with some kind of nervosity that it says that I'm now also the commentator, but when I'm looking into this audience, I really think we should immediately open up this as a joint discussion with the audience and with you. And I will just mention a few ideas that came to me when I listened to your talk. I was thinking very much about the German Jews beyond Judaism, and maybe it's not only a question to you but also to people in the audience. This became so popular when I studied history, and I mainly studied it in Germany, and I think it was very popular in Germany, and it somehow seemed to be like, even so, I think we now know that many of the arguments there are wrong. First of all, the German Jews that weren't so liberal, then he presents them. You've made this point. Schula Volkov made this point. Others made other points about Bildung as a way to exclude people and not just to include people, etc. So many of those arguments, but still, I think it's interesting as a historian to ask, why did it become so popular in Germany at the moment when German Jewish history was suddenly becoming an important topic with Reinhard Rürup and the Leo Baeck Institute. Also, I think Aleida Assmann, who is in the room, she wrote the introduction, I think, to the German edition of it. Maybe she also has an idea about it, because I thought it's very interesting how this became such a central book. Then the one thing that you mentioned, many of the positive developments that might have triggered thoughts with George now, but the changes in attitude towards public sexuality and sexual identities. On the other hand, what I find very interesting is his whole work on völkisch thought somehow seemed not to have been so deeply read and engaged with in Germany or in Europe and in scholarship. And I think when we now see a lot of political parties that really expressively take on this tradition, I think it's very interesting, because I often feel like this whole knowledge that was there seems like not present, at least maybe in this room among some specialists, but not in a broad manner. So there, I think there are reasons to look on this aside. You start and then we open.
Is this working?
Yeah. Take this one. And
all right. I'll start with your second point, which you began with, and you spoke about George's reception in Germany. Which is problematic. And I think one reason why his work was translated, as you said, 10, 15, 20 years later, is that, and this is controversial, George, not only George, Peter Gay, Fritz Stern, Walter Laqueur, had a cultural approach to the study of German history and Nazism, which meant that they studied ideologies, myths, symbols, and personal agency. Most German historians who were very critical of Nazism and who were progressives, but nevertheless, in order to avoid personal confrontations, ran to structural history, ran to impersonal processes. And as a result of that, I think that is one of the reasons why the whole thing of völkisch ideology was put aside. Why German Jews beyond Judaism were so popular in Germany, I leave to you, Aleida, and everyone else. I didn't know that. But I'll tell you the importance of German Jews beyond Judaism for me. I'm not a German Jew. I don't know if I'm a South African Jew or an Israeli Jew. But I am beyond Judaism. That is to say, the possibility of being Jewish, but entering into the stream of what I consider to be a humanistic universal culture is what I aim to be and aim to do. And in that sense, that book provides a kind of map for doing that, maintaining one's Jewish being, but without the paraphernalia of traditional Judaism. And so my answer may not be the answer that German readers have.
Yes, are you already having a question, or are you pointing that if there are questions? Yeah, there, Aleida, I think is already keen to answer.
Actually, I don't know how popular it was in Germany, this book. I know that there was a huge wave of interest in the topic of Bildung, definitely, in the 1990s. And I wrote a book 1 year after the book by Mosse came out on the idea of Bildung, referring to Mosse's book. But my book was immediately lost. It's not published anymore. It disappeared from the scene, whereas in Bielefeld, a huge scholarship was done about Bildung, totally sidelining this, my small intervention, and looking only at the social history of Bildung in this Bielefeld context. So we have to distinguish here between different kinds of interests. Historians were very focused on the social history, and whereas this history of idea and authors from the literary point of view was totally sidelined. I think the book has a shocking title for perhaps the Jewish readers because of this beyond, but it brought two very important informations, I think, to the German audience. I don't know how wide this audience was. Number one, that many, and it's focused on 19th century Jews and not on 20th century Jews. Therefore, Jelavich's focus on pop culture and all of this is not so pertinent to this 19th century approach. What he told us is that a very high percentage of the Goethe-Gesellschaften, Schiller-Gesellschaften, and also the biographers of Goethe were actually from Jewish descent. This was the first information, and the other was that in the 19th century there were very, very popular Jewish authors beyond Judaism writing about the landscape like of the Black Forest. Berthold Auerbach was really a mass author at the time, and he had been totally forgotten in Germany. So in spite of all the historical criticism that immediately followed, we should also retain the information that it brought, and that should not be dropped.
Right. Oh, there is Bernd Weisbrot and Jeffrey Herf. And
I'm not too sure, Stephen, about this argument that the cultural approach, the intellectual history approach, is so special, because when you look at the English historians at the time, like Peter Pulzer, Francis Carsten, Jim Joll, they were in some way different from Mosse's approach, and much more related to the traditional German way of arguing the case in political terms. And I wonder what it is that made Mosse so different in that respect, that he was not really entering the political debate. He was very strong in these general arguments and so on, but from a German perspective at the time, or in my case, from a perspective from Britain at the time, it was rather apolitical. And that is something that sometimes in a bad way came out in the new modern cultural history that forgets about politics altogether. And I wonder whether you could address that.
Just one word. I think Enzo Traverso is here, and one of his critiques is of the kind of non-political element in George. It's mainly culture. And it may be, and I think it's true probably of myself, that George, while critiquing Bildung, remained somebody who was deeply immersed in the cultural and probably less interested in the immediately political, although he does have essays in which he deals with the politics of Jewish liberalism, on socialism, and so on. But I do agree that the bulk of his work is clearly cultural. The reasons for that has to do maybe with precisely that Bildungs tradition of which he was both proud and critical. And also may have something to do with American socialization of emigre intellectuals as opposed to Britain, where Francis Carsten was. James Joel was not part of that crowd. James Joel was born not in Germany or was not a refugee. But anyway, I don't have any other...
I would say on that same point that everything George wrote was political, and that his effort was to widen our understanding of the political sphere, and especially of the causes in since the French Revolution, with the advent of popular sovereignty and the press and mass literacy, and the mass production of visual things, that what he wanted to do and what he did was to expand our notion of how politics actually works and why it is that the merely socioeconomic or the merely narrowly political will not tell us what we need to know. And that is especially true, I would think, right now in the United States, in populism in Europe, and on and on.
I'll discuss this a bit on Sunday, but when I think of George's, your talk was wonderful, by the way. When I think of George's comments about cultural history, I also situate him as one of those very sobered, not progressive liberals of the 1950s and 60s. People like Hannah Arendt, Albert Camus, Isaiah Berlin, Karl Bracher, Walter Liqueur, people who were liberal Democrats, believed in liberal democracy, but like Tocqueville, they were Tocquevillian liberals. They had lived through the destruction of democracy as a result of movements that were terrifically popular. And so when George went on about the symbols and the myths and he was telling jokes, really he was being extremely serious and expressing his fears about how thin the veneer of civilization was. And in that sense, his liberalism was very much that of the 1950s, the post-totalitarian experience. So the word, I don't associate the word progressive with its optimism and sense that things are getting better and that the people are wise. That's not Mosse, and you put your finger on it in that sense.
We have, I think, a number of questions. They should be very brief because we should stop soon. Since I have the micro, one question to the person who wrote about East European Jews in the consciousness of German Jews. I would be interested if you have any idea about if George Mosse thought ever about Jews beyond Germany. Did he have any idea of European Jewry beyond German Jewry? Did he have any idea of really East European Jewry? Or was it really that? Because I'm not so sure.
Well, George George came to Israel, I don't know, over a period of 20 or 30 years. I can't say he became a master of the Hebrew language. In fact, this may pass by some of you who don't know Hebrew, but he did endear himself to waiters when he went into a restaurant and ordered food and would say to the waiter, Adonai, and he got wonderful service. So George's intimate knowledge, that is true, of the daily lives of East European Jews or their languages was clearly very limited. He never pretended to be that. So even though he did teach a course on Jewish history in Madison, and my friend Sam Norwich told me that he pointed out to George almost towards the end of the course that there was such a thing as East European Jewry. But of course, so I can't say that he never interested himself in Judaism. He interested himself in the Jewishness of people who had entered into the fabric of Western culture, which I must admit is a bias of mine. And he probably shared the common kind of prejudices towards East European Jews that everyone else did, but was fully aware of them. So I would say, yes, he certainly was not a specialist in that, but that was who George was.
Oh, three, David.
Thank you, Steve, for a wonderful talk. I've always been struck by some of the parallels but tensions between Mosse's notions of liberal respectability that are so intertwined with questions of sexuality and that other great critic of liberalism on questions of sexuality, Michel Foucault. And I just wondered if you have any insight into, I have to presume that Mosse read Foucault to some significant extent, if they had any kind of relationship, if you ever expressed views on Foucault's scholarship, because especially when we read things like nationalism and sexuality, there are just certain striking elements there that would sort of beg for the question of influence or, you know.
There is somebody, I think his name is Killian, who's probably in the audience. There he is. He wrote a wonderful piece on Mosse and Foucault. So I am relieved of that responsibility. But I will say something. I always understood what George wrote. I'm not sure I always understood what Foucault writes. And most importantly, and here John Tortorici and I don't agree, I don't think George was interested in theory. He has theoretical components, but theory as such wasn't his stick. So read Killian and speak to Killian.
Thank you, Steve. A brief question. You mentioned briefly that Mosse de-ghettoized Jewish historiography once in Jerusalem, but when you presented both his take in German Jews Beyond Judaism, the Bildung paradigm, and Jewish nationalism, actually what emerged is Jewish exceptionalism, and I wonder what you make of it.
I'm not clear what you mean.
That the image, the understanding of, say, Jewish nationalism in the case of Brit Shalom that he writes in Can Nationalism Be Saved, or the turning of the Bildung into, as you called it, an ethnic asset, presents something that is maybe less de-ghettoized by presenting Jewish exceptionalism, and I wonder if you see tension there.
Well, all right, I'll just quote my friend, of whom I hope this applies to all of us. Roses are red, violets are blue, I'm schizophrenic and so am I. We all embody tensions, conflicts, and contradictions. And George, I quoted it as saying, many of George's feelings, emotions, and ideas contradicted much of the ideas that he was professing in his professional historical world. So you combine these tensions in some way. He didn't resolve them.
I just wanted to go back to German Jews beyond Judaism for a moment and comment on it from the point of view of someone who teaches modern Jewish history full time. I think what George accomplished in that work really has to be seen in relationship to the conception of Jewish history that he encountered in Jerusalem. For the Jerusalem historians with whom he engaged from the 1950s onwards, the only valid form of secular Jewish life in the modern world was and is Zionism. And I think what George was trying to do was to say that there were more options and possibilities in the modern Jewish world, and that the Bildungstradition was one of them. And that, in a sense, he was trying to create a broader, more inclusive, more liberal vision of Jewish history, which entertained the possibility of multiple forms of viable Jewish life in the modern world, including multiple secular forms. And that, I think, is, for me, the real message and legacy of that book, and George's contribution to the study of modern Jewish history.
I'll just say one very brief thing. First of all, I should have mentioned in my talk George's entire concentration on the idea of Bildung, and I was very jealous when this happens. He keeps on quoting David Sorkin, who just asked the question. So David is a key inspirer of the Bildungs paradigm for George. I totally agree with you. I never thought of that. But the other thing which should be mentioned is George wrote that book against the friend that he most admired and was scared of, whose name was Gershom Scholem, which is to say that yes, indeed, there can be a German-Jewish dialogue, and it wasn't a totally closed, one-sided, delusionary affair. So I suppose now that we're doing it, we can build up a kind of hierarchy of deep contents that go into a very slim volume.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say a few words about Mosse and Foucault, because I just reread Nationalism and Sexuality, and you can tell he's starting to grapple with Foucault in that book. I think that Foucault was too critical of liberalism for Mosse. I think that's the part he could never really latch onto, because his own work and his own life was so rooted in the defense of liberalism as the way of living and how a state is decently constructed. So I've always said that Foucault doesn't work well for the 20th century, because when liberalism is so weak and so challenged, one almost wants to come to its rescue. And that's a profoundly anti-Foucaultian notion. Foucault is best for the 20th century and how order is kept through normative behavior in liberal societies. He's not so good for when liberalism falls apart. So I think in some ways there's parallel ideas there. Foucault and Mosse both believed that normative behavior was key to social order in modern European society, but Mosse was too attached to liberalism, both out of personal experience and intellectually, to really go all the way that Foucault went in terms of criticizing the liberal core of social order.
So, if this is the last answer, thank you again, Steve, for this wonderful kind of talk, and we continue at 1:30. Thank you.